These are the Epos ES14 speakers. Epos was founded in 1983 by Robin Marshall after he left the BBC. The company was sold to Mordaunt Short in 1988, then later to Michael Creek of Creek Audio in 1999. In 2020, Creek sold the Epos brand to Karl-Heinz Fink, founder of the German speaker design firm Fink Team, a company which is currently resurrecting the ES14. The ES14s are large stand-mount speakers that were launched in 1983 and which originally sold for $13.95 a pair USD, which is $41.50 USD adjusted for 2020 rates. And that's not including their designated stands. They're a two-way speaker with a height of 488 millimeters, which is approximately 13.25 inches, a width of 226 millimeters, which is almost 9 inches, and a depth of 290 millimeters, which is almost 11.5 inches, and weighing in at 11 kilograms per speaker, which is 24.25 pounds each. The front panel is 1/2 inch MDF, and the top, bottom, and side walls are made of 3/4 inch MDF. The front plates of the drive units are rectangular castings that occupy the full width of the baffle. From what I've read, earlier models were made of chipboard rather than MDF, which apparently some people preferred. They came in black ash, walnut, and cherry, and they sounded their best on their designated open-framed stands. Both woofer and tweeter were designed and manufactured in-house. The proprietary plastic cone woofer, which is approximately 200 millimeters or 7.5 inches in diameter, was designed for superior linearity and low distortion, using a long magnet gap and relatively short coil. Its magnet is physically large in order to fully control the driver. Early models used a concave dust cap, but later models used a stationary phase plug attached to the magnet pole piece. The woofer uses an inverted half-roll surround and is reflex loaded with a 2.7-inch diameter port on the rear of the speaker, which is approximately 8 inches long. The port's designed to be filled with a foam cylinder to convert the ES14 into a quasi-sealed box design. The ES14 also houses a 26mm or 1-inch aluminum dome tweeter, which is also made in-house, and which is protected by a wire mesh grill. There is almost no crossover in this design. The woofer is connected directly to the input terminals, and the tweeter has only a single capacitor, which is a 3.3 microfarad on the Mark I and a 2.2 to 2.4 microfarad on later Mark II models. All internal wiring is soldered, and electrical connection is made through internal 4mm sockets on the back of the speakers. Their sensitivity is rated at 87 decibels at 1 watt per meter, and impedance is a nominal 8 ohms, and it does not fall below 7 ohms, thereby making them a relatively easy load by standards back then. With careful placement, the ES14 produces a fast and articulate musical presentation. They possess an uncanny ability to play a large-scale sound associated with larger speakers, but also with speed and delicacy of smaller models. Their mid-range is very fluid, open, and enveloping. They were designed to be used with their foam bungs in place. When they're out, bass can get somewhat sloppy and ill-defined, and when they're in, bass is tightened up, although it's somewhat reduced. Their upper frequency presentation is not smooth like cloth dome tweeters of the time, but they're not as etched and harsh as rivals of the same time period. Their presentation truly is large, and their sonic qualities can carry the listener away into another land, a true ethereal experience. Their seamlessness between drivers produces a coherency in the mid-range that's very difficult to find in a speaker, even in modern times. It's this mid-range seamlessness that truly was and is the ES14's claim to fame. The ES14 went through some revisions since their initial inception. There were slight changes to the main driver to make it easier to manufacture en masse, a change in tweeter capacitor resistance, and the addition of a second pair of wire sockets for bi-wiring or bi-amping. I've personally owned 3 pairs of ES14s, 1 pair of Mark I's and 2 pairs of Mark II's. Each pair sounded slightly different, and since I can't speak to the sound quality of these speakers when new, I can at least describe their sonics as they performed in my systems and as they compare to each other. Since these speakers are quite old, I'm simply describing my own experiences with them. Your mileage may vary, as they say. I'll preface this part by saying that the ES14 is extremely finicky when positioning. It takes forever to find their optimal spot in the room, but once you do, you're in for a real treat. I'll start with the Mark II since those are what I owned first. The Mark IIs were housed in my small condo. The room was approximately 18 by 11 with standard 8 feet ceilings, which is approximately, it's just a little bit less than 200 square feet. In this room, I was seated in somewhat of a near field, or I guess midfield seating arrangement in an equilateral triangle position. In this room, in this case, the Mark IIs produced a humongous soundstage. I mean, the sound was just very, very big. There was very big bass, and the sound could be boomy without the foam bungs. The bass easily filled this room entirely. There was no need for a sub in this room or in a slightly smaller room. These speakers are nearly full range, so they're more than enough in these spaces. The bass on the Mark II is a bit tighter and punchier than on the Mark I, but less pronounced. The tweeter could sound a little unrefined at times, but it was definitely not terrible. It was not particularly bright. In other words, it's not tilted up like many speakers, but sounded more in line with the mid-range and the bass frequencies. Nothing stood out. The Mark IIs were extremely open sounding, like a super clear window to the music. The Mark IIs and the Mark Is do not grab your attention initially because they don't have that initial wow factor. You know, they don't have that shiny treble and humongous phony bass that many speakers do have that, you know, impress upon first listen. These speakers, they reel you in gradually over time, making you realize just how natural they sound. When you close your eyes, the performance is really all there. Now, moving on to my Mark Is. The Mark Is were housed in a much larger room, which was approximately 20 by 16 feet with, again, standard 8-foot ceilings. So now we're looking at about 320 square feet as opposed to just under 200 square feet, which is a significant difference in room size. So the Mark Is have the same huge soundstage and really big sound as the Mark IIs. Now, the main difference that I noticed between the two models is that the Mark I has a fuller upper bass than the Mark II. So, as such, the Mark I has a thicker overall sound than the Mark II. The Mark I can adequately fill my large room without the need for a subwoofer. The treble is a little more subdued than on the Mark II and maybe a bit more grainy than on the Mark II, although I have heard others describe the opposite. The mid-range on the Mark I is perhaps not quite as transparent as the Mark II, but still very, very good. When I was offered another pair of Mark IIs, I couldn't help but say yes. So this second pair of Mark IIs was in much worse condition than my previous Mark IIs. I mention this because it could be a factor in my overall impressions and comparisons between the two. These Mark IIs were directly compared to the Mark Is in the same large 20 by 16 foot room. Unfortunately, my originally purchased Mark IIs were sold before moving to my place with the larger listening room. So by comparison to the Mark I, the Mark II has a thinner upper bass, giving them a noticeably leaner sound in my large room. These Mark IIs had a more transparent mid-range than my Mark I and seemed more delicate in the details overall. However, in my largest room, the Mark I were a bit smoother sounding and able to fill the space much better due to their fuller sounding upper bass and lower mid-range. Therefore, I sold the Mark II and I kept the Mark Is. I would have liked to compare my original Mark IIs that I owned previously to the Mark Is I currently own. I suspect they would have performed more admirably than the knackered pair of Mark IIs that I picked up later, and they would likely have stacked up much better against the Mark Is. With all that said, the ES14s are incredibly coherent speakers, which is their biggest claim to fame. They produce a big, bold sound, but they are also capable of agility and delicacy when called upon. Their mid-range is outstanding and can still compete with top-tier speakers of today. It's no wonder to me why these speakers have reached cult classic fame. They were a true marvel of their time and still compete favorably with very serious offerings on the market today. One would have to spend quite a bit of money to find a significantly better sounding pair of speakers than these old guys. As for me, I'll not make the same mistake of selling my Mark Is as I did with my first pair of Mark IIs, no matter what new speakers make their way into my listening room. They're not without their faults, and tech has surely evolved. But still, once you latch on to what they do right, they'll be difficult to replace. And on that note, it's time for me to go. Once again, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you here again soon. Bye for now.